Well, thank you, Marco. Thank you very much for having me here. It's really a great privilege and honor. And Joe and I, we date back also quite some time. We have not played together, even though I keep threatening him that I would at some point play with you. I think we will at some point. So we date back some 10 years ago. So also, I think when he first spoke at as a keynote at the Anxiety and Depression Association, and that's when we first met. And it was shortly after you published your emotional brain book, and then we started talking more intensively when you wrote your anxious book, and that's where a wonderful collaboration started. And I kind of consider you a good close friend now and a fellow traveler in our kind of quest to understand sort of fear and anxiety. So I'm going to talk about Darwin's error. It's a bit of an odd title. I want to challenge some of the thinking, and the primary thesis of that is that Darwin got one thing wrong. He got a lot of things right, but one thing wrong that unfortunately also translated to a number of misconceptions in the field. So this is a sketch from Darwin's 37 notebook, and he wrote there, I think, upper left, and then he goes on in the scribble on the right. Case must be that one generation should have as many living as now. To do this and to have as many species in same genus as is requires extinction. I don't know what that means. But then he goes on further down, thus between A and B, so you see A on the lower right and then B on the upper top. Thus A and B, the immense gap of relation, and C and B, you can see C and B, the branches on the right, and B further up. C and B, the finest gradation, and B and D, rather greater distinction. Thus genera would be formed. So the idea that species evolve and they share commonalities, and as species evolve in different branches, they become more and more different. So, and then goes further on down, bearing relation to ancient types with several extinction forms. So this gave rise to what has become known as the tree of life, right? And so any living being, as you know, as any species, somehow share a common ancestry. If you go back, and the branches will obviously divide at various points, and we often study two of those, namely rodents and humans. And as you can see, they are on different branches, and they are kind of far apart. Sometimes we also look at other species, but we use the rodent model a lot in trying to understand how humans function and what sort of the nature of human emotions also are. So, looking at the surface, a mouse brain and a human brain are kind of different. So, on the surface, a mouse brain is a lot smaller than a human brain. And if you then compare the structure, you can see in the lower left, the mouse brain has other distinct features that the human brain does not have, or reverse is probably true. So human brain is quite a bit more sophisticated, if you will, many more neurons fit on, and so forth. So there are clear differences in the morphology. So I think the gist of my talk could be summarized in this one cartoon. So here's Pavlov's dog, and the dog says, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little notebook." And there's Pavlov in the back. So in essence, the dog conditioning Pavlov in doing something. Now this is obviously nonsensical, that's why it's funny. Now why is it funny? Well, because we put ourselves in this dog's mind. We kind of think like what the dog would think if you were the dog, but you're not the dog, but that's what probably you might think if you were a dog and you observed Pavlov doing something, right? So this is the problem, and this is the essence of Darwin's error, this anthropomorphism, that the idea that we kind of assume what the animal feels like because we think ourselves into the animal's brains. And the problem, though, is that we're not the animal. We have no way of knowing that. So to make it, and I'm going to probably be a bit argumentative and difficult here in the way I'm reasoning. So this is a paradigm to study social anxiety. People are actually using that to study social anxiety. It's an animal model. So they put a mouse in one box, and sometimes there's another mouse in a chamber, sometimes it's not. And now, if you now see that this mouse is behaving differently if there's another mouse in the chamber, you wouldn't assume that the mouse thinks something like, I wonder what this other mouse thinks of me. I'm so scared, right? So even though if you were a human, if you actually experience human social anxiety, that's the essence of social anxiety in humans. We are concerned of what other people think of us. This is a problem because animals do not have that capacity, or certainly we don't know for sure if they have this capacity to put themselves in the other animal's point of view. There are some rudimentary. Darwin, unfortunately, used this idea. So this is from Darwin's 1872 book on expression. Of the emotions in man and animals, and there he wrote at the end, he concludes, the young and the old of wildly different races, both with man and animals, express the same, that's what he said, state of mind by the same movements. So here's upper left, the cat experiencing fear, and apparently this looks similar to the human experiencing fear. There's the growling wolf and also this lady who shows her teeth, similar to this wolf, and these two monkeys that seem to display happiness. So there's this issue of putting an emotional state in animals' minds, which we really have no way of knowing what the animal experiences. There's two extreme views of emotions that is still in our contemporary literature still present. On the one hand, we theorists believe that there are basic emotions that are discrete intra-individual experiences that are somehow caused by specific brain circuits, that very specific brain circuits lead to very specific emotional experiences and emotional responses. And then there's a constructivist theorists. They on the other extreme. They claim that emotions are nothing but social and language-based constructs that are completely context-dependent without any specific, unique biological substrate. I would argue that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I do not buy into the complete constructivist idea. However, I will argue later and during my talk that social context is extremely important to understand emotions in humans. Culture is extremely important in the way that we all but miss a huge explanatory portion of that experience because we're simply focusing on brain substrates and circuitry substrates associated with emotional experiences. You're all familiar with this graph that, I modified it slightly, I hope it's okay, but Joe at some point gave me permission to do that so I understood it better. So conditioned stimulus auditory thalamus, we know the lateral amygdala and the central amygdala, lateral amygdala serves as a way to combine this information coming from the somatosensory thalamus, somatosensory cortex, and then it's projected to the central nucleus of the amygdala that then has projections to central gray lateral hypothalamus and paraventricular hypothalamus, and that leads to different responses, including hormonal, physiological, and behavioral responses. This is nothing new. You've seen this slightly modified picture already before, and I think this gave this was obviously coming from his emotional brain book that was used by many as a way to now claim that the amygdala is the fear center. The amygdala is the source of the fear response, and as you heard already Dan Brown talking about the higher order theory that was clearly articulated that this is a overly simplistic view, not only overly simplistic, but actually an incorrect view. I think this is a wonderful paper. In case you haven't read it, you absolutely should read it. It's pretty dense, but there's a lot of insight into it. So making the case that we need to distinguish a fear response from a defensive survival circuitry from a circuitry that actually gives rise to fear. It's not to say that emotions don't have a biological substrates; they certainly do. But we need to distinguish the circuitry that is associated with threat and the circuitry that is associated with fear. The higher order theory links it to a number of brain areas, including the anterior cingulate and orbitofrontal and prefrontal, and puts it together in this, depicted in this graph, which shows that a general network of cognitions that are associated with this higher order theory that links really emotions to consciousness. That is, I think, the gist of it, that you can't understand emotions without really understanding consciousness. And that, again, is directly links it to Darwin's error. How do we can't make this simple association between animal models and human models without also factoring in the conscious experience and consciousness. I'm not going to, forgive me, but I'm not going to go through that in detail. I think Joe would be in a better position to do that. I would just embarrass myself. But let me just link it to more of what I'm doing, actually, sort of because it's very much in line with my thinking on to what extent it really applies to the clinical work, and I think this is sort of one of the big contributions that Joe has made. He's extremely good at articulating very complicated constructs and concepts in ways that actually also people from who are not experts understand it, and this is why his work has been so influential. The clinical field is listening to that. They have adopted that, and at some points also didn't get it quite completely right, but it has advanced the field in clinical psychology. Consciousness is very much linked to the construct of self. In a way, you can't have a concept of self without this thing called consciousness. There's also this thing called self-consciousness, meaning that you're conscious of the self. But so in a way, you need consciousness for the self to develop. And the self, I would argue, is extremely important in understanding emotions in humans. A person without the self, one could argue, doesn't really have the same emotional experience as a person without the self. Now, there are, in fact, people who do not have a self. If you just go back in the anthropological history, humans start out with a fuzzy concept of a self. The self evolves, and I will say a bit more about that. But the self sort of differentiates as the organism grows older. So the self is, however, not just a thing that we carry around, but the self is very much determined by our past. We form it as we grow older. We form it through our experiences, and we develop it on an ongoing basis as we interact with others. In fact, one could argue that there are as many selves as there are interactions, and William James has written early on in his first textbook extensively on the self, the entire chapters, and on the self and on consciousness. The culture is sort of the context in which the person is situated that determines the way you interact with others and what you experience and how you it's sort of a filter of the world that you experience. So let me just say a few words about how the self is relevant in emotional experiences in relation to others. And I'm saying that because fear or anxiety is not just an intrapersonal experience, and dealing with fear and anxiety or any other emotion is very much a thing that you experience and regulate through others, with others. You experience emotions not as a little machine that somehow processes incoming stimuli and there's an output of some sort, but rather you regulate emotions with others and through others. When you're happy, you want to share that with people. When you're sad, you want to have somebody to talk to. That's why the entire profession of psychology is there. So people regulate their emotions with others. So the interpersonal aspect of emotions, I would argue, is actually more important than the simple intrapersonal aspect. It's not to say that the biology is unimportant, not at all. It's very important, but the social context cannot be ignored. If we ignore the social context, we don't get it right. We got it, and I'll just illustrate that, why I think it's so important. So we all start out with some sort of I would say we have in us a core self, a self that discriminates aspects from non-self. This is me, and this is not me. Self in the non-self, the environment, and where we respond to internal physiological states. We feel pain, hunger, fatigue, and the interpersonal aspect is fairly limited for the core self. And then there's something I would call the social self, and this is also taken actually from a term that William James already introduced. He also identified the spiritual self and other forms of self, but the social self is the part of the self that gives rise to what's called theory of mind. That is the empathy. That is maybe linked to the mirror neurons. This is sort of the social part of the self. It contains categories that identifies abstract representations of the self in relation to specific individuals, groups, cultures. So this is where culture comes into play. And I will tell you later why I think it's actually important. And it gives rise to many social type of emotions. So embarrassment, shame, pride, etc. These are examples of social emotions, if you will, or emotional expressions where the social self is prominent. If you in a person's lifetime, sort of the self becomes differentiated. There's a core self, and the social world, this is one in a way. And then as the toddler makes experiences with the social world and also makes experience that my actions have an influence on the environment, then the self evolves. And it happens to be around the same time when language evolves, and I don't think there's a coincidence. It has to do with cognitive abilities of being able to think in more complex, abstract ways. In fact, abstract thinking, I think, is probably the thing that drives it. It drives the self-development as well as language. And then as the person grows older, the social self becomes more distinguishable from the core self, and we integrate that more. And we know we can describe ourselves then as who I am and who other people maybe perceive me and the like. So this typical circumplex model of emotions, which is a very popular model where emotions are arranged based on valence and activation, pleasant, unpleasant versus activated versus deactivated, and you can arrange any emotional experiences on this circumplex model, could be replaced with one that integrates the social nature. So I could, for example, and I think there are other such alternative to the circumplex model, you could say an emotion has high sociality versus low sociality, and it could feel you can have positive and negative valence associated with that. So high sociality might be compassion, gratitude, and in a negative realm would be loneliness and shame, and low sociality might be frustration, anger, if it's not social related, and or happiness, curiosity. You see, so the social dimension could be an important distinguishing feature. Now, let me talk a little bit about the role of the self, if I may. The role of culture on the self. So here are two examples, and we all share very similar cultures. The left one is a chicken, and the right one is a lobster. You see that. Few of you will experience disgust, right? Because we all come from a very similar cultural background. We actually probably like this idea that if you were hungry, you would probably have sort of a salivation response now seeing the chicken, and if you're into lobster, you would have something similar. Now, but consider those pictures. This is a man eating some insect. This is this lady eating scorpions. This is a plate that consists of maggots and of bugs. And people, yes, they do eat that. Upper right is these are guinea pigs that people sell in Peru. Now, this is just a simple example. We talked about disgust already. This disgust is an emotional response. We would all agree with that. And these are two different cultural experiences. If you come from a culture where you eat insects or guinea pigs, you would not have a disgust response. But we do not do that, and we associate these creatures with a particular disdain, and therefore we experience a disgust response. Simple idea. Now you can translate it to other emotional experiences. So this is now, we kind of surveyed the literature on culture-specific emotional experiences. And let me see if there. I don't think we have anything Italian specific in there, but I'm German, and you know there's an example of Schadenfreude. You know what Schadenfreude is? It is such a strange phenomenon that the Americans actually use the term Schadenfreude to describe Schadenfreude because there's no equivalent term in the language. So it's basically. Experiencing pleasure, or actually we defined it, experiencing pleasure derived from someone else's misfortune. So if you see somebody falling down the stairs, Germans find it awfully funny if you see somebody falling down the stairs. I mean, not all of them, but it's an example. There are many other such examples where there are subtle differences, but emotions and cultures are linked. This is obviously important for, as you can imagine, in treatment. So I'd just like to describe at least one of this phenomenon, or two of them phenomena actually. So Kial attacks, I've been studying that with an anthropologist, psychiatrist, my friend Devin Hinton. He lived in Cambodia for many years, and then when he came back, he opened a clinic for Khmer Rouge refugees in Boston. And he described an interesting phenomenon called Kial attacks. So Cambodians believe they have a different. It's similar to a panic attack, but it's very cultural specific. So Cambodians believe that there is the body consists of obviously veins and arteries, and there's blood flowing in these. So they believe that there are bloods flowing in these veins, and there's a little bit of space left in these arteries and veins. They go, and this little bit of space is called wind, inner wind, and this inner wind flows backwards to the blood. And when there is distress, this inner wind can be blocked, in particular in the neck region. And if it gets blocked in the neck region, it can burst and can destroy your brain. This is their belief. So Cambodians with panic attacks, they are very focused on their neck. Particularly, it's actually called a sore neck syndrome. They come into your office and say, I'm really not feeling well, I have a really sore neck. And the healer, the Cambodian psychiatrist, or the person who knows how to treat it, would do some coining. So they would take a coin, and they rub it against the person's neck in order to release the pressure. So, and it's very much panic-like, only that they don't really care about their heart. Westerners with panic attacks, they typically are concerned about a heart attack, and they would say, I have to go to a cardiologist, I think I have a heart attack. Cambodians are very much concerned about the neck. They go to get the coining done to release the pressure. Two different cultures, very similar syndrome, very different expressions, and also different treatments. Taishin Kyofusho, I'm not sure if anybody from the Korean or Japanese culture, if you were and grew up there, you would know what it is. So in Western cultures, we are concerned about doing something that embarrasses us, such as, spilling water over myself or something, and then I embarrass myself, right? In the Korean and Japanese culture, Taishin Kyofusho refers to the fear of doing something that embarrasses the other person. It is often associated with odor, like I have a strong body odor and you don't like this body odor and you're now embarrassed. You're now trying to get away from the body odor and you're now, it's twisted. It's difficult to describe, it's difficult to understand because you don't experience this. Taishin Kyofusho. There are some other examples like Takeste nervios and Shenshu. I'm not going to discuss it in more detail. So how is this related now to psychiatry in general? This is the list of our DSM books. It started with, as you know, DSM-2 and then 3, 3R, 4 for the text revision, and 5. And I was part of the DSM work group, so I was partly to blame for the mess that we created. I think we have a serious problem in psychiatry that we're still too focused on this DSM idea, and this is very much linked to also our treatment limitations. We now develop the various treatment protocols to target very specific latent diseases. And this is sort of the as I just told you that culture and social interaction and so forth are important. All of that is all but ignored in the DSM. Instead, we believe that a person has a depression or has a panic disorder, has OCD. This is this disease that people carry with them. And we believe that we can't really measure directly. We can just only indirectly assess that through asking questions, really. So how I have problems sleeping at night, and I'm feeling bad about myself, and so forth. And all of that is part of the symptoms of depression, right? So you can't really measure depression directly. You kind of infer that. So these are this latent disease idea. And then there's this unfortunate phenomenon that symptoms overlap. We call it comorbidity, which shouldn't exist. You know, in the medical field, you don't have a runny nose and a broken arm co-occurring all the time, but that's the case in psychiatry. And so we replaced in disease 1 with generalized anxiety disorder, let's say, and major depressive disorder as disease 2, and we have no way of really accessing it directly. There is now the unfortunate scenario has evolved that we now replace this latent disease with genetics. Or even worse, I think, with specific brain circuitry or brain areas. So rather than saying there's a latent disease called depression, we say, oh, it's a particular brain area that is associated with that. I think this limits our science. It doesn't expand it, it doesn't move it forward. This latent disease is not working out. Instead, and this is, by the way, you know, the NIMH also realized that after the DSM came out, as you all know. I'm not sure if you do know, but there was RDoC, Research Domain Criteria, was created by the former head of the NIMH, and there was a battle between these RDoC ideas. But just to point out, the RDoC is trying to attempt to step away from this latent disease idea and instead looking at specific units of analysis one should look at, such as genes, molecules, cells, circuits, behaviors, self-reports for various domains such as negative systems, positive valence system, cognitive systems. Was an attempt in the right direction, unfortunately still very limiting and highly unlikely that we ever find cells that are linked to any specific mental disorders. What if we completely get away from a latent disease idea? What if we examine how these problems hang together? This is now the step toward complex network analysis, which I will not discuss in detail, but I think this is the step in the right direction, where latent diseases may or may not exist, but we don't have to assume that they exist in order to study problems. So I'd like to get to a summary now. The emotions are multidimensional. They are characterized different level of arousal, pleasure, displeasure, but also sociality associated with a number of tendencies, and we haven't spoken about motivational tendencies and other things. But I did emphasize the contextual, social contextual, cultural factors that are important and that are not only regulated through intra but also interpersonal processes, how people interact with one another. This is a very important element of emotion regulation. Emotions are not just regulated through these intrapersonal processes, as I said. Mindfulness, by the way, is one way that people are trying to understand emotions in a different way, where different mindfulness strategies are involved, and if we integrate that into our existing treatment, we will get considerably better outcomes. The critical difference, I think, in order to understand, which ties it back to our what I started out with, the critical error that Darwin made was that he committed anthropomorphism as his main crime. I think that is and unfortunately people have never sort of rethought this idea that we are not animals. So we are animals, but very special animals with some capabilities that other animals do not have, and that also places a particular, raises specifically important questions. Thomas Nagel wrote a famous essay, who was at NYU, right, I believe, what it's like to be a bat, and his answer basically was, well, we don't know because we're not bats. So what Darwin, however, got right was that the basic evolutionary process through which adaptation occurs includes variation, selection, and retention in the right context. And this could provide a framework through which we can classify problems in a more meaningful way, where we look at these different dimensions, and people might be have not progressed in or show maladaptations in various dimensions because of problems in variation, selection, and/or retention. If you want to know more about this, you can read it up. Thank you very much for your attention.